morning, Dr. Thompson.
Good morning, Mr. Lassiter. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Hope I haven't kept you for too long.
No, not at all. I've just been regaling our future viewers with Ben Stein-style readings of the excerpts from the chapter, but
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic.
preliminary thoughts and considerations in
Absolutely.
anticipation of the imminent coming of you.
Of me? How
You,
about that?
yes. The
Well, I
word
look
made digital the word made digital image.
Yes, right, exactly, yeah. Sort of a non-incarnate form, huh?
Oh, we're all Gnostic now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Gnostic button pushers.
That's right.
So we had a heck of a night last night again. One of these, they have this weather system pulling air up from from the Gulf of Mexico, and it's just like every night it seems like we're just having one storm after another. We had this front move through. We stood out and watched it. Amazing black front with all these whirling fingers coming out of it. It looked like this claw that was coming over us. It was absolutely amazing.
Goodness.
Yeah, we got a bit of rain. It wasn't terribly heavy, but and fortunately we didn't have any tornadoes. But I tell you, I saw rotation in those clouds, and it was like any second now it's going to happen. So it was kind of an interesting evening for us. I guess.
Yeah, it sounds like
I
it.
guess the end was all slept through the alarm.
Ah, yeah.
So,
Right.
bring me anything I should know that you've covered so far?
Well, not at any extensive length, just some observations here and there. I mean, I think, one of the things that I want to be sure that we talk about today is, of course, the role of Providence. We've kind of alluded to this in the last chapter, that despite all their misdeeds and mistakes and foolishness that the dwarves and the Hobbit have exhibited here through their haphazard journey through Mirkwood, in the end they've come by the only way that was even possible to get through Mirkwood at the end of the day, was through the Elf King's palace, along the water courses, because the path that they had been on actually just fades out into marshes. And so that's an interesting conversation to have. Maybe I don't know to launch into it now. And then I realized for the first time here, just looking at it afresh, that I overlooked, yes, even I overlooked one instance of song in The Hobbit, and that is even the men have a song. The men of Lake Town sing a song. It's not just dwarves and elves, even the Hobbit at the end, and goblins for that matter, who get a good 2 songs in, but the men themselves have a song of their own. That's a lovely thing when you think
Yes,
about it. It is no small thing for the storyteller to give the men a song.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that and what you made of that song. I suppose that it was further on in my agenda, but might as well jump to that chase right now. What do you make of that song?
The song, so for one, the song has a much more forward driving rhythm than the dwarf song, or even than Bilbo's song in the end. And where the elves have more of a sing-songy kind of way of doing their song, especially as we saw with this elvish lullaby or dirge, depending on which perspective you're taking on it, as they launch the casketed dwarves down into the waters, out of which they're sort of in a Schrödinger cat state right now, until we let them out again. The song of the men here, it drives forward. It moves. So this is, the context is the dwarves have, of course, arrived in Lake Town, and the people are very happy about the fulfillment of these prophecies, the restoration of glory. But the king beneath the mountains, the king of carven stone, the lord of silver fountains shall come into his own. And as it goes, and I think I'm not wrong in saying that it feels, as we read it, that the forward push of the rhythm, so the cadence of this, actually becomes stronger as you go.
Mm-hmm.
So shall come, the king of the silver fountain shall come into his own. His crown shall be upholden, and his harp shall be restrung. His halls shall echo golden to songs of yore resung. The woods shall wave on mountains, and grass beneath the sun. His wells shall flow in fountains, and the rivers golden run. The stream shall run in gladness, and the lake shall shine and burn. All sorrow fail and sadness at the Mountain King's return. It's driving us forward to that last line, that all sorrow fail and sadness. So all sorrow and sadness will fail at the Mountain King's return. Hooray,
Yes.
everybody, the Mountain King, he'll return. And this tells us something then about the people, about the race of man, I would say, by extension, but certainly within this story itself, at least the men of Lake Town. But they're looking forward. They're looking forward to the return of a king of some sort. That man is oriented to some sort of restoration of the king. And we see all throughout Europe and other places, there's these, but I know most especially the stories in Europe, this common theme, this common, I don't say trope, but there's many different cultures, Celtic, Germanic, Mediterranean, North Mediterranean anyway, themes of the sleeping king who is to come back, right? Arthur, the once and future king, will come when his people need him most. The king under the mountain, who is sleeping and awake, will rise at the time when his people need him to either avenge on, wreak vengeance on his enemies, or restore the golden age, that kind of thing. That's a very common theme in different cultures around the world.
And it's a common theme in our next novel, The Lord of the Rings. It happens 3 times, actually, for the Rings. The Barrow-wights, on the one hand, who are sort of as a demonic or cursed form of this ghostly king. The second one is when Aragorn goes through the paths of the dead and demands that they fulfill their promise. The kings betrayed at Pelennor Fields, I think it was. And then the third is Aragorn himself, his restoration to the kingship there in Gondor. That's a triumphant king with the restoring of the White Tree there at the end of the story. So yes, it's a very theme. And I really like too what you just said about this idea of hope or expectation. It's something which you certainly don't see it in the monsters. You don't see it as much in the dwarves. They're all just kind of grim. They're always described as grim. You said
that's exactly right.
Dwarves, right? They'll come out, but darn it, couldn't you find a better way? Humans throughout Tolkien's stories are always these hopeful characters, despite the fact that they're the kind of the weakest of the races, and they get put upon a great deal, and they suffer this horrible cataclysm in Numenor. But nevertheless, they're filled with hope all the time. That is a startling. It is a startling image. But
it's hope, not optimism.
Exactly. Yes. Oh, right. Good. What's the difference? What do you see as the difference?
I think optimism is this idea that everything will work out in the end. Everything will work out to the best, right? Optimus. That's the best. That's what it means. Okay. So optimism, everything's going to work out to the best. And I just think that's different than hope, right? Hope is not necessarily clear-sighted in what is going to work out. And I would say even that it's not oriented towards things, quote, working out, but it's, like you said, expectation. There's an expectation of something, a yearning.
A yearning. Could we suggest perhaps that it's a difference in perspective? Because Optimus seems to say it's working out for the best for me. And hope is that song, this great Spem in Alium. I don't know if you've ever heard this magnificent piece of the Spem in Alium.
Hope in the garlic or something, right? Isn't that what that means?
That's right. Hope in the garlic. The text is something like, I have never put my hope in any other thing but you, O Lord. You have always been my salvation. In other words, hope, it seems, that Anglo-Saxon word seems to indicate that what you're doing is you're not putting your expectations in the idea that I'm going to get that new car, caviar, 4-star daydream, but rather, whatever happens, the Lord is good. The Lord provides. The Lord does love you, and the Lord will bring you home. Even if it means suffering cancer, even if it means enduring poverty, even if it means going through warfare or disease. Because those aren't optimal. But if hope remains, hope is the thing with feathers, as Dickinson says. It's that angelic thing that leads us to believe that there is something greater than this world, and there is a creator that actually does love us and cares for us and has a plan for us to be happy. That's a, I think, very important distinction.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And that, it's hope. I mean, I'm thinking, so I've recently been reading Viktor Frankl,
Yes.
the man's search for meaning and this whole thing. Those who aren't as familiar with him, he was a psychiatrist from Vienna and is Jewish. And during the Third Reich, expansion of the Third Reich and all this, he got hauled off to Auschwitz, actually a couple of different camps, but he survived the Nazi death camps as a Jew. He was already established psychiatrist at the time, was writing about the importance of meaning and purpose and all this. And then his experiences, of course, only further highlighted that. But one of the things that he recounts is, the case of two different kinds of people in the camp. One is saying, we're God's chosen people. He's not going to let us suffer. The gas chambers are right there at the end of the square, the other end of the camp. It's okay. God will redeem us. He's always redeemed us. He's always saved us, right? He'll always keep us from the enemy. And there's another fellow who's there who's like, yeah, Pisha, whatever. The prayers, I'm not so into this. I got to focus on just surviving here. It's not two different people. One appears to be oriented towards God and God's plan. Hashem has a way. He's going to save us. The other one, less so, more concerned with the Bainal. Well, things inevitably progress, and the both of them are being led off to the gas chambers. The whole lot of them are being led off to the gas chambers. And the one guy who's been saying, God will save us, don't worry, God will save us, we're his chosen people, just before he's entering the gas chambers is looking, and he just says under his breath, there is no God. The other guy goes in singing the Shema Yisrael, right? Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. There is one Lord. And the latter one seems to me to be this is like the perfect illustration of the difference between optimism and hope.
Yeah.
As the one is, I am yearning for my God, and he loves me despite whatever, come what may. I have a yearning for that.
Yeah.
And that's an orientation that comes from within here. Whereas optimism is oriented towards some sort of exterior objectives, not an internal purpose, not a yearning.
Yeah, that's
which is interesting. We could. Oh, sorry. I don't want to go on a pontificate on a monologue here.
No, it's not that. I think that your observation is quite profound. I always like to read Viktor Frankl in contrast to Elie Wiesel. And although I like Elie Wiesel, every time I look at Night, or I think the other one is Dawn, boy, you got to have some intestinal fortitude to read those books. They are not for the faint of heart. It's a very cold look at the experience there in the death camps, but it's not. He doesn't look at it with any reflections towards the divine or the otherworldly. It's all just the suffering. Whereas Frankl, on the other hand, is reflecting philosophically back on it. And as you mentioned, he's talking about how does man cope? How do human beings cope and still hold on to hope in the midst of this sort of this suffering? There was a great movie, by the way. I don't know if I ever passed this your way. It was called The Death of God. And I think it was done by HBO back in movies. And it was about the dramatization of exactly this. Oh, no, it was God on Trial. That's what it was, God on Trial. And it was a trial that was actually there in Dachau, I think, where the Jewish people who were condemned, debating whether or not God had abandoned his covenant, they should hold him liable for it. And it has the same image of the different types, of different human types. Some of them clinging to a false hope, some of them saying they abandoned God, and all of them at the end experiencing this being pushed towards the gas chambers. And at that last moment, how they react. It's a stunning movie. Like Silence or like reading Elie Wiesel, you have to grip points to watch it, I gotta say. But that's a dark subject for a bright day. I think the bright subject is this idea of hope. I'm really amazed at the resilience of the human characters in Tolkien's story, and he even talks about with certain characters that humans in his stories have this ability to bounce back, to come back, to keep returning even after great devastation. I can't help but think that Tolkien, knowing history, would have seen that over and over again in history. You look at some of our historical moments and you think, good Lord, how did humans survive? I was reading the famine of 1317. There's a god-awful disaster.
That was a rough year. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a tough year to be alive. And, and then you had the 100 Years' War. We were just reading about the Battle of Crécy. What a god that was. You have these moments where like, I think people would just roll over and say, we're done. That's it. But somehow the human race keeps surviving, keeps enduring. It's a very powerful thing. I think a lot of it is due to this hope, this idea of hope.
I think that's right. And I would assume, and I know there's I'm sure great biographies about or examining, analyses of Tolkien and the role of the Great War in his life and all of that, because he of course was a participant in World War One, and there's a world of difference between some of the more popularly known trench poetry and The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, the whole legendarium of Tolkien. There's something different here. And I'm sure he would say there's a reason for it. You've got two kinds of people in the trenches too.
Yes.
Yes, like two different responses to suffering.
So like Siegfried Sassoon, for instance, or who's the great one who wrote Dulce et Decorum? Wilfred Owen, Dulce et Decorum. Right. They're great. Yeah. And Sassoon's poetry is fantastic. But it is very depressing. What is the end line of Dulce et Decorum? Asked, had you seen this horrible sight of this guy dying by gas, you would not be so eager for some taste of glory or to proclaim Dulce et Decorum est pro patria mori. Yeah. In other words, those ideas of glory, of heroism, Owen seems to suggest, are not something you shouting out if you saw what suffering really looked like.
Right.
Not to say that I dislike Owen. I really like Owen's poetry, and I like Sassoon's poetry. But you're right; they are not to proclaim the greatness of God and the glory of the human race and the ability to hang on in terrible circumstances. I was thinking this morning of how to set this piece of music. I've gone on this quest to set these pieces by Tolkien to music, and so far I've done 3. And I'm having fun with it at least. But the one that I'm looking at here, I thought this morning, there's a song out of Henry V, the movie, where the composer, and I forget his name, sets the Non Nobis Domine to music. Remember that from way back in the day?
Yeah, that's really good. I like that.
How about that? Right? The king beneath the mountains, the king of carven stone, the lord of silver fountains shall come into his own. But as a choral piece, as people sing together.
And into a round like they do too after the battle. Yeah, that'd be great. I think that's right. That would be very good.
I like it, especially with the idea of hope in there, because of course the Non Nobis Domine is giving praise and thanks to God after this tremendous victory at Agincourt, right? And that, Cameron, that also raises this other issue that I did want to talk about. The characters in this chapter are particularly intriguing. This chapter sits, you could either say this is the beginning of the second part of the work. I like to think of it more as the centerpiece, like in an archway. So, because if you've got the 8 on the one side and then this one and the 8 on the other side, this one will be the resting place. It's a transition between that journeying to the mountain and then the journeying at the mountain, the completion of the journey. And it's always been a hard one for me to teach, because what in there is, what is there to talk to students about necessarily? It doesn't seem like there's a lot of action or like things blowing up. There's no like Michael Bay, boom, 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 anything in there. So what do you talk about? One of the things that you can talk about is
yes, exactly, the characters. They were dead, and then they come out of the barrels, and they wish they were dead because they're still alive, and they're not happy about it. And well, you could, I mean, this chapter 10, you could teach it. I mean, I think you could have a whole thing of the critique of Das Kapital and the bourgeoisie and the dominant cultural hegemony of Lake Town.
And that issue open the character of Bard that we see.
Yes, exactly.
So where to start? First, you brought up the dwarves and their unpacking, the unpacking of the dwarves. This is it's a neat little scene. Thorin gets something. Okay, real quick. They've been put in barrels. They go down the river. They come out. They're unpacked. They're miserable. They go up to Lake Town. The bard leads them up there, and then they meet the master who's dining with the elves, and he says, "Oh, hody dody dody, I got to entertain you." Men create songs, and finally they're set off on their journey again after much rejoicing. Yay! So when they unpack Thorin gets out, and he's really mad. I mean, what does he say? A wet dog or something. He says.
Yes. Let's see, how does it, I'll just pull it, I happen to have this right here. First of all, a barrel was cut loose by Bilbo, pushed ashore and opened. Groans came from inside, and out crept a most unhappy dwarf. Wet straw was in his draggled beard. He was so sore and stiff, so bruised and buffeted, he could hardly stand or stumble through the shallow water to lie groaning on the shore. He had a famished and savage look, like a dog that has been chained and forgotten in a kennel for a week. It was Thorin, but you could only have told it by his golden chain and by the color of his now dirty and tattered sky-blue hood with its tarnished silver tassel. It was some time before he could even be polite to the Hobbit. "Well, are you alive or dead?" asked Bilbo quite crossly.
Yeah, one of the things that I came to about teaching any piece of literature is sometimes you just have to revel in the literature. It's not, you don't have to.
That's right.
You don't have to look for symbolism. You just have to say that's a great passage. It's so delightful to read this.
Right.
And this is one of those passages. Thorin gets out and he's like, "Oh, girl, what the hell are you thinking?" And then Bilbo's response, because Bilbo's really, he's getting hair on his chest here. He doesn't say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Thorin Oakenshield. I'm so scared of you, and I didn't mean to hurt you." He's like, "Well, what did you want? Are you alive or dead? You want to go on with this stupid quest?" It's a great image. I also like the fact that Thorin comes out and he's got the sky blue hood has become clouded, and the silver has become tarnished. So he's like a gray day.
Exactly. Yeah, he's a great day.
He's alive. And it's a bit of a resurrection image, as we mentioned before. But it also, this is something I like about Tolkien, is that he doesn't have resurrection with the dwarves popping out all happy, like, yippee! Frequently you see images of either the Christ or of Lazarus coming out of the tomb, and they're all fresh and spanking new and all this. But the reality of it would be, like Martha says, "Lord, he's been dead for 3 days. There would be a stink. There's going to be a stink." Because coming out of the tomb, you come out and you're not all pip hoppy and ready to go when you come out. Right. So here's Thorin. He comes out and he's definitely like a trauma almost. He comes out of this tomb and he's alive, yes, but my goodness, he looks like this dog that's been penned up.
Yeah, draggled, dead and beat.
Yeah, but it does also speak to the nature of the dwarves too. The dwarves are dormant and then resurrected. The dwarves come out and they're all the grumbling types, but they didn't come up with the plan to escape. And then the dwarves immediately recognize their the need to go on with the quest, and so they're able to pull themselves together. So it does say something positive about the character of the dwarves. I can't help but think, going back to that idea of the unwrapping of a dwarf plaything at Christmas. When you unwrap the toy, does the toy come out like in Toy Story, all grumbly? I've been in that box forever. Prospect. Anyway, that's one interesting character. There is the dwarves. The other interesting character is Bilbo in this. Bilbo, I think, begins to become far more, not aggressive is not the word, resilient. He's far more resilient.
He's resilient and assertive. He's steadfast now. He's steadfast.
Yes. And even at the very end of the chapter, if I could skip really quick to that, the very last line in the chapter, it says, the white oars dipped because they're going up to the mountain. The white oars dipped and splashed, and off they went north up the lake on the last stage of their long journey. The only person thoroughly unhappy was Bilbo. All the other dwarves were like, yay, we're going to kill the dragon. And Bilbo himself has become much more of a realist, I think. He's become focused on the idea that, it could go the other way. This whole killing the dragon thing, it's kind of a two-way street. And we could be the killers.
That's exactly right.
I do have to point out, too, this long lake that they describe is it's like a Finger Lake up there in New York or something. It's a formation that would have been created by a fault line of some kind, like Lac Lamond or Loch Ness in Scotland. And I grew up like that when I was in Michigan, and it's really quite an experience because our lake there in Michigan, Long Lake, was at one end of it, you look out and it looks like ocean. You can hardly see the other end of it. It was that long, and so it looks like you're looking at an ocean. And when you travel up it, especially on a clear day, it's a beautiful experience in the morning when you're traveling up this lake, and the mist from one end of the lake begins to lift even as you're traveling down it, almost in quiet and solitude, almost like some entity leaving the lake. It's a magnificent experience. And this image of them going up the lake at the last, it really gets me every time. I think back to my own childhood and to that experience of growing up there on Long Lake, and thought, yeah, I can see myself living there in Long Lake there at Esgaroth. That'd be nice.
Yeah. It would be.
But anyway, so Bilbo. And along those lines, just as a final thought on that, Tolkien has images throughout his story that are like that beautiful image of the mist lifting and the white oars splashing. And I really respect the man for that. He's got these tremendously dark images and images of danger and peril, but he's also got images of great beauty throughout his work, where you just reflect on something, or you see something gorgeous, or there's a moment of quiet. And I don't know. I mean, there aren't that many authors that are capable of conveying both at the same time. Tolkien's really quite a master in being able to take you through a story that does have peril and danger, especially true in The Lord of the Rings, but which doesn't overwhelm you with the ghastliness of it or the darkness of it. It's almost like it's almost like it could happen in the real world that way. The real world is a mixture of the beautiful and the perilous at the same time. And this chapter certainly has that in spades.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think you're right to say this chapter in itself, there's not a lot of action, aside from, of course, the arrival in Lake Town and this celebration, but it seems to be a chapter of coming together. And it's a coming together of, you've got this, between one page and the next, you have, Thorid looking like a, savage dog that's been chained and forgotten in a kennel. Yeah. And then, the next thing you know, they're all out and they're getting, dressed in these fine garments. Within a few days, they're all, splendid because the people are praising them. Isn't this wonderful? You're dressed well and you're, hurrahed every time you so much as show your nose out the door. Everything. And then you've got, these coming together of darkness and light, the coming together of dwarves and men coming together, and the elves are there, and sort of these things kind of start to flow into one another. And even then at a deeper level, because of the character of the Master of Lake Town, was a great contrast. Bard and the Master of Lake Town are another great contrast, but the people rejoicing at the return of a king from under the mountain, and as the Master of Lake Town sort of weaves his own theme into that, highlighting especially the monetary benefits that come from the king under the mountain, and tries to get the people to focus on that, because of course he's a businessman, and that's how he gets his power. The cultural, the ethics of Bard versus the ethics of the Master of Lake Town are very different.
Yes, and
then you have the dwarves and the elves sitting at opposite ends of the hall. The dwarves come in, and then the ambassadors of the elves, the elf ambassador to the men of Lake Town, are sitting at banquet with the men, and they recognize immediately. Oh crap! Those are our prisoners. Those are the guys I saw them last week.
Yeah, right. Yes, and I want to dwell on that image of the Master of Lake Town even before, and I want to look at Bard too, but that image of the
Hmm.
Master of Lake Town. You know, as you're talking, you talked about a contrast. It just occurred to me that there's a contrast here in the men of Esgaroth at the south end of the lake and the dragon at the north end of the lake. So just as there was a contrast between Bilbo and the dragon laterally on the map, there was a
Mm.
contrast here vertically, if you will, between the men and the dragon. So
Hmm.
it's almost like the men have a tendency to dragonishness, and that seems to be very much connected to this Master of Lake Town character.
Hmm.
As he's described, he is definitely the bourgeois, money-minded, capitalist, grubbing type. Even
That's exactly right.
yeah, even from the start, the very description of the town back at the start of the chapter says here, uh, dreary as had been his imprisonment and unpleasant as was his position, to say nothing of the poor dwarves underneath, and still he had been more lucky than he had guessed. The talk was all of the trade that came and went on the waterways, and the growth of the traffic on the river, as the roads out of the east toward Mirkwood vanished or fell into disuse, and of the bickerings of the lakemen and the wood elves about the upkeep of the forest river and the care of the banks. So at the very beginning, we get a slight change of tone in the discussion and the interest of the people. The elves that he's overhearing here are talking about the trade on the river with the lake town, and how the men of the lake town
Hmm.
are trading with them, because of course they're bringing the Dorwinian wine up from the south, I think it is, and then trading across to them and trading other goods as well. So from the very
Hmm.
start, you get an image of trade and commerce, which is the key element of this little town of Esgaroth. I have to point out, of course, that this is the first time, if I'm not mistaken, this is the first time that human beings have appeared in the novel, right?
That is exactly right. Yes. Any
They,
mention of them, I mean, briefly mentioned, but not present, you know.
yes, yeah, briefly mentioned but not present. Everything else has been wizards or dwarves or hobbits or goblins or spiders or giants or big bear men. It's
Hmm.
not been human. So, with our first
Right.
taste of our first taste of human, our first taste of human. That's where actually that's probably where we hear about humans is with Bert and Tom back with the trolls, right? I would
Right.
love to go man flesh.
Ain't gonna come up here just to be hit by you and Bert.
That's it.
You had a village and a half between you. Yeah, that's, you know.
So anyway, this is the first exposure to the human colony or a human
Right.
civilization had, and the first thing we get is that it's connected to trade,
Hmm.
and the master of the town is himself. He's the tradesman par excellence, right? It says
Right.
here,
He manages his accounts well. Oh yeah, you've got the text right there.
yeah, it manages his accounts well. It says the unexpected arrival of Thorin therefore causes great excitement among the Escort. But that's not what I want. That's Olson Corey. I want to get to him in just a minute.
Yeah.
As for the master, he saw there was nothing else for it but to obey the general clamor, for the moment at any rate, and to pretend to believe that Thorin was what he said. So he gave up to him his own great chair and set Fili and Kili beside him in places of honor. So the master of the town immediately recognizes that even if he thinks these guys are charlatans, everybody else says that they aren't. And he needs to go with
Hmm.
everybody else in order to be elected. Because if I'm not
Hmm.
mistaken, isn't the elected position, is that the master of the town? I forget, but I think it is.
Yes. Yes.
So he's a politician as well as a capitalist.
And this is where, you know, it's important. So, and there's another element to the Lake Town thing is they are placed strategically. They're in every way the men of Lake Town are the middlemen.
Huh.
They also don't seem to produce things for trade necessarily, although in a secondary, close reading, we can see secondarily that they probably do. They have farms on the shores of the lake and that kind of thing. But they're introduced as the people who don't necessarily have an investment in the thing itself. It doesn't matter what's in the barrels. Their job is to just move them. They move them from, you know, downriver, further downriver, Dorwinian and other places in the south. It comes up here. The barrels, they send them up the river to the to the Elf King, and vice versa. Boss man says move them, we move them. That's what they do. We're men. We're the middlemen. And
what you get another day older and deeper in debt.
yeah, Lake Town. That's exactly it.
Maybe I should set the song.
Characterizes. That's the bourgeoisie as a spiritual condition, right? It's not merely the bourgeois mind, as Christopher Dawson and Nikolai Berdyaev talk about it, is not merely a socioeconomic class, but we're talking about the spiritual condition. There, what is it that characterizes the bourgeois, even as an economic class? It is one who's not invested in the thing itself. He's not an artisan who produces something. He's invested in what he does. He's he's somebody who's invested only in currency and stands in the middle, transporting in between things, and it doesn't matter what it is. You just move it. You just keep it moving, and that, like you said, is like the master. To obey the general, what was the word? To obey the general clamor of the crowd. Like that's his defining principle.
Yeah, and we want to make clear here, neither Dr. Cameron or I are against capitalism, nor are we against politics. These are necessary things in life, okay? So we're not communist or anything. But like you pointed out, the bourgeois mindset is one that sees the end goal being the gain of capital, the gain of stuff, the gain of material. And it is willing to obey the general clamor, go with the flow, do what everybody else wants, in order just to shuffle the goods from point A to point B. Okay, so it is a spiritual problem, not a political necessarily, or a monetary problem, right? And that's what Tolkien seems to be much against. I mean, I think at one point he even says, he talks about, on the one hand, that he's a monarchist, or has monarchist tendencies. But he talks at one point about communism. And he says, if I'm not mistaken, I have to look this up, but I'm pretty sure he says he doesn't like communism, but he does tend to gravitate towards certain things that they put forth. Which I always find kind of interesting with the old fella. That why would he see goodness in communist principles and yet at the same time say he's against it, he disagrees with it? I think it's because he was very much a realist. He was a realist. He saw the spiritual problem, but he didn't think this was the solution.
Right, and there's very much a problem, and this is where who's the polar opposite? Who's the balance? Not going to say balancing pole. Who's the alternative in Lake Town that we see? Who did Tolkien create? He creates the last scion of the King of Dale.
Yes.
He opposes the bourgeoisie with the nobleman, not with the proletarian.
Yes,
and that's the fundamental difference.
A nobleman who, I don't know for sure, but when I was growing up, Bard, we're talking about, Bard always struck me as a sort of proto-Aragorn. He's like...
very much.
Aragorn was developed.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
He's described as a grim-voiced man. So he has that quality like the dwarves of being grim, taking on things and be like, get off my lawn, But he also is a man who is capable of commanding others. He's a man who is capable of killing a dragon. He's a man who is, as you said, an heir to royalty. And this is really significant, he bears the name Bard. The master of Lake Town has no name. There's no name to this guy. I mean, you can call him anything. I don't know. I won't call him anybody current because I don't want to slander somebody, but you could call him Taft, right? Taft.
Right.
Whatever he is called, the master, and that's it. Consequently, the master is a nameless being that could be anybody within that bourgeois society. Technically,
exactly.
He's elected to be anybody.
He has no essence. He's just as French has a beautiful way of expressing this. The idea, I think, of what he is. The French have a word that means sort of somebody, like somebody is also the word for a nobody, en personne, right? And he's just a person. He's a person. He's a somebody. He's a nobody. Could be anybody.
He's a real nowhere man sitting in his nowhere land.
It's different from being a mensch. That's,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
Bard,
Yeah, and
he's a mensch.
he's a mensch. But the master is not. The master is, and by the way, I gotta admit, Stephen Fry, and I like Stephen Fry very much. Stephen
Yeah.
Fry played the master very well in the movie. I'll give that to Jackson. If you've
Yeah.
seen the clip, you'll see that Stephen Fry plays him as a greasy political skunk.
He does really well with it.
He does a very good
Wow.
job with it. And he really gets the idea. Well, first off, the only quibble I have with the master in the Jackson version is how the hell did that guy get elected? You know? Let's see. This good-looking guy and that good-looking guy, and then this greasy guy who's losing his hair and has this little thin mustache. We'll elect that guy.
We'll do that guy.
I don't know if it works that way. But he does play it very well in the sense of the guy is this loathsome character who's just weak. He's just oily as anything. We've seen that in politicians and in businessmen, I'm sure. Politicians who they're slick, you know, they're oily. They're like, you look at the guy and you think, you know, I don't know if I even want to be near you. You probably are giving off photons or something like that. It's going to cause cancer in small children.
Right. So I want we've brought up the word bourgeois a number of times, and I think it's only I've realized that perhaps we've not defined what we're talking about. So to our dear viewers and listeners out there, I would say, and I just want to cite in short what Christopher Dawson has to say is part of a much longer essay, actually a series of other essays they wrote various times. What do we mean by the bourgeois when we're talking about here as a sort of a socio-historic class of a type, but also a spiritual principle. And this is as follows. Let's see, here was a good spot to actually pick this up. Okay. The bourgeois was originally the middleman who stood between the producer and the consumer as merchant or salesman or broker or banker, and thus is not merely an analogy, but an organic. There is not merely an analogy, but an organic connection between the role of the bourgeois in society and the economic function of money. One is the middleman, and the other is the medium of exchange, the middle piece of exchange. The bourgeois lives for money, not merely as the peasant or the soldier or the artist often does, but the bourgeois lives for money in a deeper sense, since money is to him what arms are to the soldier and what the land is to the peasant, the tools of his trade and the medium through which he expresses himself, so that he often takes an almost disinterested pleasure in his wealth because of the virtuosity he has displayed in his financial operations. In short, the bourgeois is essentially a money-maker, at once its servant and its master, and the development of his social ascendancy, historically, shows the degree to which civilization and human life have become dominated by the money power, beginning of the early modern period.
Yes. I like that. That's good. The servant and the master is
the servant and the master.
You know, Dante has in his Inferno a section there in Hell where the money makers, he encounters the money makers or the money changers. And this, of course, was different from us in the Renaissance and the medieval Renaissance period. But he sees that the people that he puts in hell are there not because they make life better for other people, you know, not because they're making money and that's a bad thing. They're there because money for them is the God. Money is the thing that they worship. And if I'm not mistaken, I'll have to make sure I confirm this, but aren't the money changers the ones that are sitting in solitude on the edge of this cliff and they don't talk to anybody else? They're just alone. I think that's what they're doing.
I think that's what they're doing, but yes, they're huddled together, kind of curled up on themselves like a sack of gold.
Yeah, like a sack of gold, right?
In the Malabolge, yeah. Exactly.
I have to look that up. But the point being is that the money changer ends up being alone because he doesn't see the purpose of wealth. He doesn't see any point beyond wealth. We've got a great guy that we work with who I just can't sing his praises enough. He's fantastic. And he really does help people recover from financial debt, financial ruin, and he's able to encourage them to be able to increase their capital. But the reason he does it is because he himself has gone through poverty and he knows how hard that is, and he wants people to be free. He wants them to be happy. In other words, his point is make money in order that you have money, or even make money in order you can buy that yacht or that Ferrari. His point is you make money so that you can survive and your family can survive and you can be happy, and then you're free to do what you want to do. I mean, that's a great attitude. I can even plug this guy's show on our podcast. I don't know if I should or not. He does a great show. His name's Todd Rooker, and he does a great show called Cover Your Assets. It's a fantastic show. Listening, check out Cover Your Assets. I'll give a link, and you can listen to it. It's fantastic. But I think the final thought is, my point is, when you see a character like the master, his whole purpose is to make money. Money is his God. And it's not the happiness of his people, the guidance of the town, the prospering of the town for any other reason. It's in order to make money. And that is a lonely and deadly place to be. Right.
And I think what you identified in this fellow you were speaking about I would draw a distinction even further and say that though he's operating in a bourgeois profession, because we're all bourgeois, and look around now, we're all bourgeois today, as Charles Péguy laments. He's operating there, but he's not talking about money. His goal is not financial security. His goal is wealth. What he's talking about, he helps people attain a level of wealth where they can live. It happens that in many modern Western societies, and especially in American society today, wealth is denominated by monetary value. This is not universally the case. Certainly not historically, and even today, not universally across different societies. It's denominated by money, and so that's the way that you talk about it. But it seems that his orientation is to help people attain wealth, which could otherwise, in say, 14th century France, have more to do with expanding land or some sort of other means of production, a mill, a forest, something like that. Just as easy as today, the modern American talks about money. And that's the difference in this spirit.
It's a huge difference too. It's a difference of perspective. And if I could say, if I can make a connection here, which I haven't thought through yet, I do that a lot. The difference is as stark as the difference between hope and false optimism.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that's exactly right, because this is a people. So we saw that man has hope, but the spirit of the master of Lake Town is not a hopeful thing.
No,
it's calculating.
It's calculating, and it's going to make optimal amounts of dough, optimal amounts of cash.
Right.
But it's gosh, what was the idea? Basically, it's that if you have hope, you are wealthy. Because your wealth, as you're mentioning, is not connected to the money itself. It's connected to the joy and the family and the civilization and the God. Your optimism is the prayer of Jabez. It's I'm going to get cash, and I'm going to have the dough, and I'm going to get more dough, and the dough is going to make more. That's the optimism, because when that doesn't happen, when you don't get the caviar, then the Lord is bad. It's the Lord's fault. Why is the Lord doing it? And I think want to take it to the extreme too. The false optimism, the bourgeois attitude, it extends furthest realm in the realm of the dragon. The dragon is the first extension of the bourgeois thing.
Exactly. In fact, Tolkien described early on in the story, what the bourgeois spirit looks like by describing the dragons. Indeed, they hardly know a good bit of work from a bad, though they usually have a good notion of the current market value. They can't make a thing for themselves, not even mend a little loose scale of their armor.
And does it make a difference if they come out of the north? I don't know. Maybe this is like the what is it, the Bilderbergers, right, or the Hanseatic League or something.
You know, there's connections there with that, certainly from the sort of the historical cultural imaginary that
Yeah,
Tolkien's working with.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
an interesting thing is you're tying that the idea to the hope versus optimism. That, you know, Bard is a grim man, but a man of hope. The Master of
Yes.
Lake Town is a slick man, but a man of calculating. He's maybe optimist. He's trying to make things optimal for himself, and perhaps, you know, in his better moments, thinking of the financial prosperity of Lake Town. But he's opting for something, and he's calculating about it. That elsewhere in this essay that I've got from Dawson, he characterizes sort of two spiritual types. He's drawing on French philosopher Sombart, and the idea is that there's this erotic type and the closed type, and the bourgeois is the opposite pole of the erotic type. Now, erotic we mean not like erotic, like you know,
Pornos.
racy movies or something, but he's using the word erotic in the terms of the sense of the Greek word eros, which means longing, which is that yearning, that longing that characterizes hope.
That
The
we talked
bourgeois, on
about.
the other hand, is fundamentally, exactly as we were just discussing earlier, is by its nature non-erotic, but rather closed.
Yes, and because it's closed, it's hunched over like Dante's image. It's
Exactly.
also alone because the erotic seeks union with others. That's why the perversion of the erotic in things
Hmm.
like porn is so horrible, because it seeks union with something that's a fantasy. It's not real. The real
Right.
erotic seeks union with other people and with one person specifically in a sexual way in marriage. Whereas the closed, that's the term, the closed man seeks isolation. He seeks to be alone. He crawls off like Gollum into a lonely cave where it's dark, and he's that's where he is, hunched over his little
Hmm.
treasure, little precious. Um,
Exactly. A hoarder of merits with a self-sufficient moralist ethic.
there you go. The uh, the image is very powerfully connected also to the great image in Anglo-Saxon of Grendel. Grendel
Yes.
is the grinder, is what the word means, Grendel. And the Grendel comes out of the swamp where he lives alone. And he comes to attack people who have wealth and joy. Not wealth in the I have lots of gold sense, although Herod is covered in gold. But
But not money and prosperity, but joy
right,
and song,
joy
right?
and
That's
song.
what ticks him off is the song,
Yep,
the noise
gets
down
happy.
in yeah.
He's like, "Hey, you kids, turn that music down. It's 3
That's
a.m."
right.
He's the character who goes out there to destroy everybody else's good time, and he does in a really bloody way. But then he runs back. Of course, I love it that things don't change. He lives in the basement of his mother's house playing video games.
Yeah, it's exactly it.
But he lives alone in the swamp, which is the perfect image for what we're talking about
Hmm.
here. And if I could skip ahead, I'm going to skip ahead a few
Yes.
chapters here, because the character of the master as well is known through his full arc, his full story arc.
Hmm.
We get here the image of him being driven by the general clamor and by this man who was greasy and political and bourgeois and all this, and who pretends to believe, as it says. But then it goes on in this chapter to say this about him when it becomes revealed that the dwarves are actually going to be going to the mountain. He gets a little scared. Here's the past.
Exactly.
For the first time, the master was surprised and a little frightened, and he wondered if Thorin was, after all, really a descendant of the old kings. Why is he frightened? What's there to be frightened about? That's striking. Um,
Exactly. Because he's
in,
absolutely out of his reckoning because that's not a calculated there's no that's risk there's no clear ROI to that,
there's
right?
the thing. There's the thing. Whatever the mind focuses on expands. And if you think a
Mm.
certain way, everything becomes part of that way you think. The man with a hammer, everything's a nail. For the master, everything is about profit, gain and loss. So what
Mhm.
gain could you possibly get going up against an 8-ton dragon? I can't, the
The
show,
odds are just not in your favor.
not in your favor. I'm a little scared about the fact that maybe you're serious about doing this. It may also be that he's frightened that dwarves are the non-factored in element. He didn't expect them to arrive. When they did arrive, he incorporated them in. He gave them a seat of honor. But then when he incorporated them in, they actually were going to go forth and do this stupid thing. And now he's a little frightened that this is going to upset or disrupt his calculated plans of control and his continued money-making and power holding. That makes me frightened.
Right.
Which, again, to draw the parallel, the Master is a parallel to Grendel, and is a parallel to Gollum and to the dragon, but he's also parallel to Sauron later on. Sauron is nothing else, and we've laughed about this, my daughter and I. What if the forces of Mordor are not evil and nasty? What if they're just kind of bureaucrats and very run-of-the-mill, boring, ordinary bourgeois types? And what if Sauron was like the head of E.L. Fudge Motors, you know? He's just this bureaucrat. At which point, that little thing that comes into his world that's not part of the calculation, the little numbers that he can tot up, is frightening to him. Even that small thing that he can't control. He wants to control everything, not out of evil, although it is evil. Not out of evil. It's not,
right.
I'm evil.
It's like a sickness. It's not the evil, you know. Yeah, but it's a sickness.
Yes,
and it is. Because for him, like the dragon, like Sauron, Master of Lake Town, it's more than just about money. It's about popular acclaim. It's about, I mean, it's like all the vices put together into one comfy, self-sufficient, plain bourgeois. I mean, it's like Bilbo early on, right? The dwarves, he was scared of the dwarves come bursting in on him. Okay, fine, I'll have you for tea, but, you know, then get gone, because adventures are nasty, discomforting things.
You know, along those lines, and I'm going to want to come back to this passage in just a second, but along those lines, have you noticed that we've had about 4 or 5 bursting in on images in this story? You've got the dwarves in the beginning, but they burst in on Bilbo. Then you've got the dwarves and Bilbo bursting in on the goblins. Then you've got the dwarves and Bilbo bursting in on Beorn. Then you've got them bursting in on the elves in the forest. Then you've got them in on the Master and the men of Lake Town. What's up with that?
Right. That beware of dwarves bearing gifts. I mean, you know, you see the dwarves coming down the road, quick lock the doors and pretend you're not home. That's what that means.
Right? I've been saved. I'm Catholic.
But that's an interesting point, because let's go back to the first episode when we were talking, and you drew the fact that these are earth spirits. These are elemental spirits of some sort. So the dwarves bursting in on your nice, bourgeois, comfortable little hobbit hole is something of the divine, the wild spirit in its own way, despite the moral character of the dwarves actually tends more and more bourgeois, as we see, as revealed when we actually get to the doorstep. Their unheroicness in some way, but that gets transformed after the slaying of the dragon. We'll see that. But they're these earth spirits there's something otherworldly about them, right? They're fey. They've got a strange, charming magic. You know, they say, get the instruments, let's strike up some music. When we're way back in Bilbo's hobbit hole, out of nowhere, they're pulling out a cello, a harp, drums, these flutes and clarinets and oboe. And where did that stuff all go? It's like Mary Poppins' purse. It comes right out of the sack. There's these things. Because there's something otherworldly. They're not of this world in the sense that they don't inhabit the same kind of space of reality that we do. So they're bursting in because they too represent some sort of otherworldly encounter. And it upsets all your plans.
And maybe that's part of the major theme here. You said they don't inhabit the same world we do. I know what you're saying, but a nuance of that is they do inhabit.
Yes, they inhabit our world. They inhabit a different plane of reality, maybe, or you know how to say they exist on a different plane of reality than we do,
or
within the same world.
How about we put it this way? Our plane of reality, to some degree, is limited by our own perception, our own what we want to see, we see, and occasionally things come up that we're like, whoa, That's not part of my worldview. What the heck is that? You know, what is that thing? Like that video I showed you of the tree taking a leak, you know.
Exactly.
As my friend said, can we just get some privacy tree here, you know? For those who didn't see the video, there's a tree that grew over a natural spring where the spring actually erupts every now and then and water pours out of the tree. It's really a phenomenal thing to see. It's gushing water like a river out of it, and then it stops and it goes back to just being a tree. It's really this phenomenal event that occurs. And if you were a normal Joe walking down, you know, and see a tree taking a leak, and you'd be like, what is that? Is that an ant? What is that? We had an experience like that last night, actually. And this is startling to me because everybody, every human, can't speak for, you know, Thermians, every human has this perception of the world. And a lot of how the world operates is dependent on our perception, because we only notice certain things and we don't notice others. But occasionally things occur that break into that perception. As you said, the dwarves breaking into Bilbo's home. And when that occurs, the whole thing is there in order that we come out of our perception broadens. So the other night we had the storm come up. We're all standing out there looking at the gray clouds and the gray, you know, funnels and the gray sky. And there's a lot of gray. But we look out and there's this point in the clouds to the south where it's almost like it pushed upwards like a torus image. And it was orange. It was bright orange. And it stayed that way, and the orange began to spread. And we couldn't figure out what on earth, what was that? It wasn't in the west where the sun was. It didn't move like an airplane. It wasn't like it was a reflection off of something else. It was this orange light in the clouds that spread and then moved north with the rest of the front. It was the most amazing thing. We all stared at this thing and then we said, yeah, it's aliens. It's got to be aliens. You know?
Yeah,
everything's alien. Can't out. But that was a moment where my own perception was startled. And I immediately, this is an interesting thing to me, I immediately tried to figure out scientifically why that would occur. Why? Because I think most of us want control over the world around us. We want the world to be stable, and comprehension, explanation, is a way of having control. In our modern things, our whole explaining of things in a scientific manner is in order that we have control. If we take the mystery out of the thing, we have control over it. And then the world is demystified, as the whole Enlightenment experiment tried to do. And we can control it. We can make it smooth and safe and ordered. We can pave the earth, you know. It's going to be awesome. And Berlin will be clean.
Right.
And there's something warped about that. I mean, even though it's a natural tendency, even though there's nothing inherently wrong in a person trying to do that, there is something warped about that when it's taken to these extremes, like in a dragon way, which I think
that's it. Yeah, and I think you're right. Like, that's a way of trying to tame reality, to tame the cosmos, because I can fit it into my clockwork. I can clockwork that orange in the clouds into my nice little system.
Yes, my Bruce. Yes, my druids.
Right.
Yes, and if we end up not making a world that flourishes, we end up making a scorched earth. Everything gets paved. It becomes a dragon wasteland. So one has to be very careful not to try to control everything, either intellectually or physically, even though at the same time, a modicum of control, you know, a nice tidy garden would be nice. Nevertheless, it's a dangerous thing. And that's, and going back to this passage, like I promised I would, I think that's where the master sees something on the horizon of his scorched earth, and he's scared by it. And the passage goes on to say this: he wondered if Thorin was after all really a descendant of the old kings. He had never thought that the dwarves would actually dare to approach Smaug, but believed they were frauds who would sooner or later be discovered and be turned out. He was wrong. Thorin, of course, was really the grandson of the king under the mountain, and there is no knowing what a dwarf will not dare and do for revenge or the recovery of his own. But the master was not sorry at all to let them go, as it says further on. They were expensive to keep, and their arrival had turned things into a long holiday in which business was at a standstill. Okay, and he thinks, let them go and bother Smaug and see how he welcomes them. Certainly, O Thorin's son, Dror's son, was what he said. You must claim your own. The hour is at hand, spoken of old. What help we can offer shall be yours, and we trust to your gratitude when your kingdom is regained. So here's the master, frightened by this possibility that this stuff is real, because he thinks at first frauds, because he himself is a fraud, right?
Exactly. Right.
And what does Dante say about frauds? He has a little. He has a little to say. The entirety of the lower levels of hell are concerning fraud. All those Malabolges are all concerning fraud. Right. And even the great creature that carries Dante down, Geryon, I think his name is. Dante down is a fraud creature. It's a monster of fraud that carries
it has the
down.
face of a man and the body of some sort of like serpent lion kind of thing, doesn't it? If I remember right.
Yeah. I love that image, the face of a man. It reminds me, there's a movie called Nine, which was a animated movie. And in it, they have all these machines in the animated movie. And very scary movie, by the way. And in the thing, the hero confronts this monster, where the monster first shows up as this doll face, this baby face. Comes around a corner, and it's this baby. No, what is that face? Well, behind the face is this huge serpent body snaking back up into the dark. That after it mesmerizes him, it starts to attack him. You see the spider character come out. It's really this amazing scene. But the point being is it starts with that face of, oh, hi, how are you? You know, I'm your friend. And then you realize there's something behind that fraud that's really awful, really terrible, and doesn't want your good at all.
Right.
You know? The master wants them to get eaten by the dragon, but he says, oh, yes, we're with you. We're going to help you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And in case it does work out for them, remember us in gratitude once you get your goods. Feel free to send some of that down this way.
Lolly our way, yes, right.
Always hedging his bets.
What is it that Hamilton says about how the face of the tyrant more often is hidden behind a species concern for the good of the people? I think that's the line of Federalist Papers. The face of the face of violence really hides behind a specious concern for the good of the people. That's very much the master here. And if we skip ahead a few chapters, we find out what happens to this guy, right? I don't want to give but his end is not good.
It's not pretty. And it's on his own doing. He is his own undoing.
He's in the wasteland, and he is gnawing on his gold, and he dies gnawing on his gold.
Dies in the wasteland gnawing on his gold. What an image.
What an image. What a terrible thing. I mean, he's sad, but he's terrible. Yeah. And like you pointed out, juxtaposed to him is this character of Bard. And I just really want to, for a minute, this is a quotation I found by
Bard.
Corey Olson, writing about Return of the King in the book. He writes, the unexpected arrival of Thorin causes great excitement among the Esgarathians, who immerse themselves in a fantasy that is only tangentially connected to the old prophecies and is almost completely detached from the world around them. The practical master is capable of adapting to this new situation by assisting in the composition of new songs from which he profits. Eventually, it is Bard, though, whose voice in the battle against the dragon is the voice of legend, when he is revealed as the direct heir of Gideon, Lord of Dale. Okay, so there's a lot in there in Olson's quotation. The main thing that I want to focus on is the people who compose this song. We see it as this great song, glorious song. It's detached from the current situation. The dragon's still alive, and he's very, very dangerous. And it's not just going to be up and knocking on his door and asking for, $50 million. The master, though, sees this as a possibility for himself to profit, because he's that grasping type. And eventually you get juxtaposed to him, Bard. So you've got the people, the master, and Bard. And Bard is himself, as you said, an heir to Gideon, Lord of Dale. He is courageous. He is grim. He's very well trained, and yet he is I think he comes off first as the master of the chief of the guard. He's not leading the city. And the big question there would be, why not? Why is he in a subordinate role? Why is the master of the city not allowing somebody like this to actually lead the city? That's kind of a big question. We find out that Bard later takes on the role of leading everybody.
Even before he goes and reestablishes Dale, he's not only the slayer of the dragon, but he becomes the real He becomes the real people's champion.
Yes.
After he himself is born out of the waters.
Right. Because they draw him out after city collapses. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And like many noble families that had been displaced by the violent rise of the bourgeois class to overthrow them in the French Revolution and subsequent revolutions of the 19th century, many displaced nobility likewise similarly dedicated themselves in very difficult conditions to the service of the poor and the wounded and the suffering during and in the aftermath of the Great War as well. And so I think you've got a similar thing with him, and they, many, although some families were able to maintain a position or another in a government, of the new order. Many were displaced and intentionally kept out of any sort of influential position, because the spirit of the Master of Lake Town does not admit of nobility and daring and knights errantry kind of stuff. It doesn't fit into the clockwork, and so you have to keep them out. There's a perverse fixation on an anti-nobiliary spirit in that kind of order, and so I think that's precisely why. And we've seen that played out historically as well. There's a great fear of the nobility in many of the new bourgeois kind of societies.
Don't we see it even reinforced all the time in our own culture? Well, American culture, I don't know if Italian, but in American culture, we see it reinforced over and over again, where the underdog is the hero, or the nobility is horrible and awful and destructive, or you see the nobility being portrayed as these popinjays, and that's a common theme that we see over and over and over again. Very seldom do you see the characters that do come from a noble line who are actually very good people and do try to help other people around them and take care of their own tenants and take care of their own charges, whatever they might be. Right. Even though those exist historically, they aren't portrayed very often in
and they're not exceptions. And they're not really the exceptions, but there's the dominant ideology of the New Order societies that has to make them the enemy. I mean, look at a lot of American mythology. The bad guys. Very, very common theme for the bad guy, the chief bad guy, to be Lord somebody. He's never chairman of the board, so and so. He's Lord somebody who's the dark. Lord Licorice on Candyland. Yeah. And sure, you've got Princess such and such or King Candy. You could say it's balanced, but there's an element there. You see a lot of this. The ordinary man, the ordinary person rising up and being the hero against the evil person who's always portrayed as Lord somebody. Even in Star Wars, Lord Vader and the Emperor are the bad guys, and the peasant boy with the hippie hermit are the good guys. There's a lot of good elements in that, because of course you do have evil emperors and evil Lord so-and-sos. But of course, when you know the backstory, at least as it developed, Luke and Leia themselves are, of course, descended from, nobility and Skywalker, all that kind of stuff. But is it interesting that what many people in the modern West, and especially the American cultural mindset, feel most comfortable with is a middle class existence, and the middle class guy is the hero, where any sense of lineage is something to be avoided or eschewed.
Yeah, it was a very startling thing to me. I think it was in my 30s when I started to recognize this, that there are people that it's legitimate to beat up on, and there are people that it's not legitimate to beat up on. I'm talking about how our society tells us these people you shouldn't beat up on, but these people, it's okay to beat up on them. It's a terrible lie to be fed for most of your life. And when you wake up to the fact that you have been fed this lie, that this is okay to do and this is not okay to do, that's a little startling. That ancient image of the king was problematic to teach to certain classes after about 2000 or so. Before the 2000s, most people seemed to understand what the image of king meant. And it meant something about nobility of character, magnanimity, courage, doing something with your life and not being just idle. And then sometime around the 2000s, I started having problems every time I brought up the king image. People would say, but aren't kings horrible? Don't kings treat people terribly? And don't we have problems with kings? So, yeah, it shifted, it changed. So kingship, it seems, is actually more talking about a type of character rather than just having it in your blood. It's really talking about character. Like what type of person are you? Do you lead other people? Do you go out of your way to help others? Do you strive for greatness or perfection? It's sort of a magnanimity thing. And I think that our understanding of kingship has altered very, very drastically. So we now, on the one hand, idolize kings far too much, but on the other hand, we denigrate them in popular culture and see them as enemies of the people and the like. And I think Tolkien, who himself was a monarchist, was seeing kings in that sense of character. Bard is a character who should be leading men. He's the rightful ruler, not the master of Lake Town. And his kingship is based partly on his descent from Garion, Lord of Dale, but it's also based to a certain degree on the name itself. And I don't remember, I don't think I brought this up before. Do you recall whether I brought this up before? The name itself is important?
No.
The name...
Yeah, I mean, the name is important of a thing, but you haven't talked about the name of Bard.
Yeah. The name itself is important because Bard ends up being the character that creates song and artwork. And that, as the passage from Corey Olsen said, he is the voice of legend. The bard, or the shop, or the many-sanger, he is the character who continues artwork into futurity. He is, as Hamlet says, better to have his good recognition now than as opprobrium, because he will be the one who remembers you. The bard, the creator of art, is not just the guy who continues culture, as Joseph Pieper says in Leisure, the Basis of Culture, but he's also the guy who slays the dragon. And I think that when we look at it this way, that certainly we could say slaying the dragon in a religious way, a psychological, philosophical way, doing good deeds, loving your children. Those are all important to slaying the dragon. But for Tolkien, writing in an artistic idiom, slaying the dragon involves a creation of something beautiful in the world, an artistic creation of something beautiful, because art has that ability to confront the Minotaur or to confront the Gorgon. It is a way of getting it, based on love, by the way, because like in the Minotaur story with Theseus, that labyrinth is created by Daedalus, who himself is sort of a bourgeois type. He's concerned with his own gain and sees his creations not as artistic, but as tools to gain power over the world. So Theseus goes down into the dark in that story of the labyrinth, and he confronts the monster and kills it, but he is connected by love, by a clue, a thread, to Ariadne, and he comes back out after he's done due to love drawing him out again. But the whole story is a creation of artwork. It's a creation of a bard, a creation that tells us, how do we confront that dragon of the Minotaur? How do we defeat that thing? And a large portion of our defeating the dragon is through our artistic creation, our ability to create something beautiful out of the darkness of our existence.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's accidental. I don't think it's accidental.
No, it's because the bard then is a story singer. I mean, because stories, especially in Anglo-Saxon culture aren't merely recited, they're sung, right? You sing a story, you sing a spell, and that way you can fight the darkness, and the light,
Yes.
like an arrow, can penetrate even into the heart of the dragon.
Yes. Good. Yeah. And the spell idea that we brought up before, the god spell, to tell that tale of our own resilience, our own magnificence, but also the magnificence of the divine, and the tale of the divine breaking into our world in these unexpected ways. That is a reminder to everybody that the material is not the only thing. It's not just the bourgeois gain of capital, that is the end goal of life. It is these moments of beauty and the seeing of the orange, whatever in the sky, that's the moment of beauty that keeps us going as human beings.
Right, because beauty then, and art, beauty created by man, through the bard, like you said, can be a vehicle for the divine breaking into the mundane,
Yes.
and thus be that encounter with the divine that elicits love, right? Because that's what beauty does. Beauty elicits love,
and draws you out of your otherwise bourgeois existence in your hobbit hole, which could become dragonish, so that you're forced to confront the glorious possibilities of your own existence, rather than just the day after plodding gray day in your own small world. I also think it's interesting that the existence of bard as the first human civilization shows us the bard who composes the songs and defeats the dragon, who himself is living in this element of the lake, in the city of the lake, because
say more about that.
It's a perfect image here, I think, that they're living on the lake, which is it's the primordial element of water. But then, as I mentioned before, when I was a boy and we'd go out along the lake, and you'd see off in the distance just the horizon of the lake and the sky above. It's as though the divine element of the sky and the mortal element of the water came together in this horizon. And it's that's where human beings live, is between the sky and the water. And it reminds me of something that I find is sort of the elephant in the room with this chapter for me. When I was growing up as a young guy reading this book, I thought that's a really cool image of Esgaroth, of the city of Esgaroth, that it's on the lake. And I'd love to live on the lake. I grew up out on the lake, canoeing on the lake, fishing on the lake, swimming in the lake. And it was always this kind of like childish fantasy of, boy, it'd be nice to have a home on the lake and live on the lake. But as I got older, it became a little bit problematic because, of course, the question is, how did they build that thing? How do you make a home on the water like that? I mean, that's a lot of effort to dig down into the lake bed and put the pylons in and then build on top of the lake. It's a lot of work, a lot more than just building on the ground itself. And what's more is that you would be on the lake when it freezes, and so your house would be subject to colder conditions. And in the warm weather, it might be cooler, it's true, but you'd be subject to mildew and lake smells and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
But why would you live literally on the lake rather than out on the ground near the lake?
Right.
And this was particularly interesting to me because Tolkien was basing this whole creation of Esgaroth on an actual event that occurred in his own childhood, 1905.
Really?
Yeah, there was a archaeological discovery in 1905 of these pile dwelling cities in the Alps, of all places. Southern Germany, right at the foot of the Alps on these lakes, and then in northern Italy, right before the Alps. People in Neolithic times, 5,000 years or so, or about, were creating cities on the lake, on pylons on the lake. And the whole complex of them, there are lots of them. It's not like one or two. It's like hundreds of these cities have been discovered since 1905.
And inevitably, it's hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands more, if that's what's been discovered.
Yeah, it was not just a single thing all over in the Neolithic era, that people were building their houses on pylons in the lake. You can actually go to a reconstruction of one on Lake Constance, apparently in Germany. I'm going to butcher the German here, so gird your loins. It's at Fallbau Museum Unterhuldingen in Lake Constance in Germany, you can visit this reconstructed site of these pylon cities. But really, this is startling to me because, again, why would you do this? Why would you create a city on water? The effort would be tremendous, and it would be inconvenient in so many ways, so that the convenience of like a cooler environment in summer is outweighed by the inconvenience of mold and mildew and being vulnerable to all kinds of natural phenomena like floods and freezing and wind and all that. And I suppose you could say they were protecting themselves from their neighbors, but there are other ways to do that that are more.
I mean, build a Motte and Bailey, which would also be, you know, contemporary with these things. You have, you could build palisades and you know, man them or not man them.
Or
it's a defensive thing.
Why not do that? It's much easier.
I mean, it's certainly fundamentally uneconomical.
Yes, it is
to build this essentially this floating city.
Bad use of manpower, right? Bad use of your economos in general. So again, why did they do it? And not just once. It wasn't just an anomaly. It was all over. It was ubiquitous, apparently, during the Neolithic era, that they built these homes on lakes. And Tolkien was fascinated, right? And he built Elskiraf and that.
Right, and all of these, or at least a number of, I mean, Lake Constance, Lago di Garda, Lago Maggiore, Como, all these, to name the Italian side, but Constance and these other lakes as well. They're long lakes, right? These are glacially melted lakes. Some of them form part of a river. Some of them are valleys that are essentially flooded, right, from the waters that have flowed down from the mountains.
Yeah.
So I mean, you've got a similar kind of geography as what Tolkien sets up in the story. And in Tolkien's story, well, what does Tolkien tell us? Why they built this? They used to be sort of on the shores, and then they built this city out on Lake Town, out on the lake as a defensive thing to defend themselves from the dragon. Right. So one element is simply it's uneconomical, which is very undragonish. But it's not just against it's not to defend themselves against the wild men who live in the east or something like that. It's specifically a dragon.
Mm-hmm.
And so in our own world, I mean, and really Middle Earth is meant to be the same world, just in a different time.
Yeah.
But these pile cities in these on the lakes, the waters around the Alps, if these are defensive, they're meant to be defensive, but defensive against some other kind of enemy, otherworldly kind of enemy. So a spiritual, demon. It's fairly common in many cultures. Since we're speaking Europe again, I can speak most confidently about that. But many European cultures, the idea, and certainly within Tolkien's own legendarium, the idea that evil spirits can't cross water, or at least can't do so very easily. That there's something hallowed and sacred about the waters.
Yeah.
That maybe you build out on the lake, not merely because it defends you from the neighboring tribe, which it may do, but if you can build a boat, so can they. But if somehow it's understood to be spiritually protective,
yes,
the idea that there's a sacred reason for being out on the water, the Lady of the Lake, somehow you're out, and this could go real deep, in terms of the femininity of the water, the idea of the Lady of the Lake, sacred lake spirits, creatures. If you just take the Arthurian legends as a launching point for that, there's a lot that could be said. But it seems to be fundamentally a sacred or religious reason.
I think that's it. I think you're touching on something here which we don't see. We talked about perspective defining what you actually end up seeing. I think that in our modern mindset, it's very hard for us to conceive that ancient world people were frequently motivated by a religious, superstitious, mythological reason, not so much by an economic or even practical reason. I mean, it happens over and over. Right. You say why, for instance, did the Romans, like the Roman people, were pretty practical. Why did they build their cities, which are they're like squares, right? Right. But they're surrounded by a circle. That's a geometric shape. It's a religious shape. That doesn't make sense unless they were doing it. I mean, the square makes sense, but the square with the circle, that's a religious image. They had a sacred defensive system. Or why did the Aztecs, for instance, why did they build Mexico City in Mexico city. It's a terrible place to be building a city. Unless there was, as you said, a water crossing issue, that they were defending against something which they saw as a real threat. This is kind of spooky to think about. A real threat that water would somehow defend them from. You know,
Right.
you're, and I in America here, we don't necessarily have the same phenomenon. But I have heard from Europeans, especially in the North, that there is still this sense of the existence of certain creatures in our world.
Oh, absolutely.
You know,
That's very strong.
very, very strong. And they chalk it up to superstition, fine. But when there are certain things that happen that really don't have explanation, and somebody says, well, that was a sprite, or that was a goblin, or that was a ghost, you don't have an explanation, Mr. Science.
Right.
What explanation do you have? That thing seems to have some reality. And the people in the world saw it as a very eminent reality. It was right there with them.
Right. Yeah, you caught the cold sickness in the head thing, and you're all messed up because you were out after dark on a certain kind of night, and the Purton were coming by, and you got that because you got infected by the dark spirit, by the malaria.
Yeah. Yes, and the
Um,
modern mind wants to say, well, there's a scientific explanation because bad air during the time that we thought bad air caused it, or because of bacteria or some kind of virus, because we want control. We want to control everything.
right.
But
This is just as much a scientific explanation too, because when you break it down, you're going to tell me there's tiny little microscopic spiritual being, little living creatures inside of me, some sort of amoeba. That's a nice fairy figure, crawling around, causing havoc inside of my body or inside of me. Is really, when you start to break down modern medical explanations, or sort of just the facts, kind of materialistic science. At the end of the day, we really deconstruct them. The explanations are kind of the same level of plausibility. It just puts and both of them utilize arcane terminology to make it sound more real.
Yes, it's a difference in perspective that's explaining a phenomenon, the same phenomenon. You know, like for instance, war victims, shell shock victims. Okay, no physical damage on a shell shock victim after the Great War, but the man couldn't use legs. His legs wouldn't work. Well, modern science say, well, it's because neurons in his head were disconnected during the tremendous shelling that happened. Therefore, he couldn't, the energy from his head couldn't go to his legs. Okay, fine. What if it's just that he experienced something so horrific on a spiritual level that he just shut down? I mean, it's explaining the same phenomenon, really, but in a different way, a different perspective, one acknowledging that there actually is something beyond the mere exchange of juices in the body. And because if you see the world as materialistic only, if you see the world as just a big machine, your explanation for why the pyramids are there, or Stonehenge is there, or Catalhayek,
or Göbekli Tepe.
Göbekli Tepe, there is no real explanation for them from a practical, mechanical, scientific point of view. I mean, you can't say, for instance, the pyramids were built in order to encourage tourism, right?
Oh God, no. Yeah.
Stonehenge was created in order to map the stars, but that's because they saw a mythological connection between stars and the spirits of this earth.
Right.
And if we discount it, it doesn't make any sense at all.
No, man is not merely operating according to liberal economics.
Right.
That's when it comes down to it, somebody like Tolkien or Dawson's criticism of the sort of the bourgeois mind as a cultural type isn't criticizing capitalism in favor of communism or something, but that both Marxism and sort of material liberalism, capitalism and certain frameworks is an materialistic, economical view of man rather than a richer, fuller, open view of man.
Yes, right. I don't remember who it is who said, when asked, what is the problem with communism? And the answer was materialism. And then he was asked, what is the problem with capitalism? Materialism. Yeah. And John Paul II, I don't remember, but I love that because it's seeing it. The problem is really not that communism capitalism, it's that you see the world's mechanical or material. And
both of them are industrial mechanical view
yeah.
of the human person.
Yeah. And if we take the counter of this and we say, okay, the ancient people really did take these things seriously. Grendels are real.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Spirits and ghosts and sprites are real. How do you protect your village from that? Well, you make it in the middle of an impregnable water fortress, a water crossing fortress.
Because there's a power in the water that doesn't allow them to cross.
I would be very interested to find out if there are structures at the same time period built on land, and whether those structures on land had a similar like structure to them, because that would be intriguing.
It would be. That's fascinating to me. And I don't know the time frame, but I know they still exist. On Lake Titicaca, in the Andes, there are also cities or towns, villages, built on the lake out of reeds, bound together into huge bundles of reeds, where they built these floating towns.
Wow.
And then the buildings are then built out of reeds, their boats are built out of reeds. Really fascinating.
That is fascinating. And again, it's very hard for us to get our mind around it. When we build a city or have a city built for us, it's because somebody sold their cornfield in the middle of nowhere, you know. Our cities are built as economic centers to feed into the shopping malls or shopping centers, you know, convenience to your job.
Right. So in other words, still following the same patterns from the very beginning, we invented agriculture to serve the temple needs.
Yeah.
And so now we've got in the modern West, you've got agriculture still serving the sacred temple needs of the shopping mall.
Yep.
And the business center.
Yep. When I was a boy there in Michigan, we inherited a house. Basically, bought it from a guy who was already building his house, and we finished the house, moved into it. Our large family living there in Three Rivers, but it had water on two sides, and then there was a lake, and then there's a very deep ditch between this small lake and the larger lake. And it was only later on that I found out that ditch was man-made by the Indians, by the locals, the natives, whatever we call them.
Yeah.
Dug this huge ditch in order to connect with water, the small lake and the big lake, so that the land was surrounded on three sides by water. And again, that's one of those, okay, why? Because if it's not economical, why did you do it? The only explanation was that they saw it as a religious thing, that it was sacred, that that was, and I feel guilty about it, we were building on a sacred site. And for us, it was, you know, we built it there because it was convenient. It was connected to a road that led to the main small town of Three Rivers, where we would school and work. But it's hard to get our minds around the idea that ancient world peoples were very motivated by this religious, sacred idea of the earth and the stars and the spirits that walk on the earth. Timpson's ley lines, for instance, in Britain, or the locating a thing in an area that was sacred originally. I mean, you can't like. I found out that the Celts, in their religion, they would go and they bury trees upside down in their sacred sites. Upside down. Why would they do that? Tremendous amount of manpower. The reason being is that they thought that the underworld was more real than the upper world, and that they were giving a sacrifice to the underworld that would then grow into the underworld. It wasn't that they were stupid and couldn't figure out which way to put a tree in.
Right.
It's that they saw this sacred world as almost more real than the world in which they were stomping around there in Neolithic Europe.
Yeah.
I don't think it's an accident either that the image in Christianity is of a man held up on a pole between earth and sky.
Right. The fully unified, deified man.
Yeah.
God manified. So hold on. So Lake Town then is not only, we see in Lake Town, again, the convergence of all these things in this chapter.
Yeah.
That in Lake Town, with the Men of the Lake, Eskarov, it's not merely the midway point in this bourgeois sense of being a medium of exchange between this kingdom in the south or wherever it is where the wine is produced in Dorwinian, traveling upriver, and the barrels coming back from the elves, from the wood elves downriver, being a medium of exchange in the bourgeois way. But we also see another way that there's the more right and proper way of being in the middle, or standing in the midst, the proper vocation of man is not to be the bourgeois medium of exchange, but rather to be somehow mystically suspended between the deeps of the water and the heights of the heavens.
Wow.
Like
Yeah.
Escaroth is on the post, on the staves,
Yeah.
rising up out of the waters. So
Yeah.
they're still in the midst, but in a radically, totally different way.
And in some ways, our exchange, not an economical exchange or a different kind of economos, our exchange is between those earthly powers, the dwarves, that create out of the earth, and those quasi-divine powers of the elves, which we are constantly in an exchange between those two powers, the deeps and the heavens. That's the position of human beings. And it's the position of little Bilbo as he becomes big Bilbo. You know, he moves from being nothing in the whole to becoming really human, actually, because we find out later hobbits are a form of humanity. Mm-hmm. As his journey progresses, he seems to be coming into his own as a fully grown human.
He's coming to full stature. He's no longer being a small person, but a bigger person.
But I guess in this instance, he is an agent of commerce between the powers of the earth and the powers of the sky.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So maybe Tolkien is suggesting human beings, the first appearance of them in the work, human beings have this ability to convert from those powers of the earth to powers of the sky and back and forth. And the proper way to do it is through artwork, through Bard, not through the of seeing everything as fraud and easily something for monetary, mechanical wealth.
And through generosity in a way which we'll see in a future chapter, later chapter, future episode, in Bilbo's reversal of the Promethean theft in ransoming essentially ransoming with the Arkenstone to deliver it to the elves from the earth and spirit to the more divine, restoring that back to them in order to ransom peace, essentially, for the sake of all the parties involved.
Yes.
And so then Bilbo he's traveling up the waters. They've spent a fortnight here in the Escaroth. He and the dwarves are traveling up the waters, and Bilbo, the main protagonist, the guy we're meant to be identifying with them, is traveling up the waters towards the large, engorged, demonic version of what he was back in the little rabbit hole. Now he's going to another hole with a real dragon in it to confront this, to confront what he could have become, what he would have become, in order to overcome that, to become something greater.
Yeah, his own personal Garyon, right? And that is where we end the chapter with him traveling up the waters. He's worried though, but he's traveling up the waters on his journey
to face his fate.
Right? Exactly. Yeah, and that's a good place to stop, I think, right there, because we're setting him off on the journey. We'll look at next the irony. You know, the irony of this chapter was a warm welcome. It really wasn't that warm a welcome. Of incorporating his titles into the meaning of his chapters. So we'll have the next one, which is on the doorstep, and we'll see how that being on the doorstep of another cave-dwelling creature is perhaps parallel to other cave-dwelling creatures having things on their doorstep, as we saw earlier. But we'll tackle that next time we meet. So, Cameron, thank you. This has been very good. I really appreciate your time and your patience. And as usual, the conversation, fantastic. So, until we meet again, sir, farewell wherever you fare. To Ares, receive you at the journey's end.
May the winds under your wing bear you where the sun sails and the moon walks.
Indeed. Thank you. God bless.